Hi everyone, we've learned about intros, let's talk about conclusions. So what should that last paragraph of any type of paper do? And again, these are strategies that will work for any type of academic paper or even, a lot of newspaper articles and other types of even movies, other types of compositions use these types of strategies as well. So they really are blanket strategies that you can pull out again and again as you are composing any type of text. So effective conclusions have a lot of important jobs. First of all, they can wrap up the essay by reminding your readers of what your main points were. Now, you don't need to list all of them, but the first sentence or so should sort of just call forth some of the main ideas that you were discussing in the essay. Again, you don't want to just restate your thesis. You've already read your thesis, especially in a short paper. You don't need to restate the thesis, but that first sentence should be sort of a general restatement of what it was you were talking about. The job of the conclusion is also to broaden the scope of the paper. So the conclusion can break some of the rules. It can move a little bit beyond what the paper was talking about and when I say broaden the scope of the paper, I'll sort of explain some ways that you can do that. The conclusion should always explain the significance of the discussion that you're having. So why does this matter? You may have heard the conclusion called the so what place in your paper. So it should always give your audience a really strong sense of why this is important, why the stuff that you're discussing in your paper is important. So important to other people, important to society, important to the world. It should also give a really good sense of audience and purpose, and that is related to significance as well. The conclusion should always make it clear who you're addressing and what you want from them. It's also a place where you reflect on what you've said and offer any final thoughts. So this can be really valuable if it's a personal type essay. And the conclusion is the place in the essay where your language should be most vivid and strong and powerful, because it's your last chance to leave an impression on the audience. So you always want to make sure, sort of word for word, that you're choosing very powerful language in the conclusion. It's also a really good place to pull in some emotional appeals and ethical types of appeals to really drive home to your reader the importance of the message that you are sending, whatever type of composition you're writing. So when I say broadening the scope of the paper, here's some things that you can do. First of all, of course, why does it matter? So you can move sort of beyond what you've already said in the paper about why it's significant and talk about why it matters on a bigger scale. So why it matters to the world, why it might matter to others, what lessons should we be learning from this. You can also do sort of a call to action or make it clear what you think should happen next. If you're writing a research paper, maybe you say, we need to be doing more research on this issue, or now that we're beginning to learn about this, here are the steps that we need to take. So it's a place where you make clear, now that your readers have been enlightened by your paper, what do you want them to do about it? What do you want to happen based on this newfound knowledge? You can also explore what's going to happen in the future if you haven't already done it in your paper. This can work really well in a personal essay if you've talked about sort of what's going on with you now, while where do you see this leading you in the future? Or if you're writing some sort of argument or research paper, it's a good time to explore, if we don't do something about this, what could our future look like? Or if we do step up and do something about that, like imagine a better future. That can be a really good thing to do in the conclusion as well. So let me show you an example of a student conclusion. Now, please keep in mind, I pulled this from a rough draft from a student's previous semester, rough draft paper. So it needs development, but it's also definitely on the right track. It's doing a lot of things that the conclusion should do. So this was a personal essay about what it was like to grow up with a disabled mother. And in this case, it meant for the student that she endured some unfortunate sort of verbal and mental abuse in her home. So she says, as I continued on after the years of mental abuse, I'm working on moving on. So this is a conclusion that looks to the future and talks about, like what she envisions as the future. This has solidified my career choice in psychology because of my experience with a mentally damaged person. Like the wording needs a little bit of work, right? Because this is a rough draft, but we worked on that. And seeing how it affects everyone around them and their lives. These years, as regretful as I am, have shaped me into the woman I am today. It's also made the bond with my brothers and father stronger due to our shared experience. It has been a struggle sometimes, but I'm finally beginning to like who I am and what I have become. So, final reflection and looking to the future. Really powerful stuff in the conclusion. Needs some work, but it's doing the right things. I also want you to think about what I call a bookends intro and conclusion. So if you look at the graphic here, wherever you start, it's a good idea to sort of come back to that in the conclusion. So you return to the idea or scene you began with. You return, you revisit, and you reflect on what you started with. So, for example, if you began with some statistics that described a problem, you can sort of harken back to those statistics. If you began with a specific news story, you can return to that news story and talk about like what happened next, what's happening for that person later, or we need to keep this news story in mind as we think of legislation that can prevent this problem. If you started with a personal anecdote, a personal story, sort of return to that and say, what became of that? Who are you now? How did that impact you in the future? And that will give your essay a really good sense of tidiness for your reader, that sense of, satisfaction because you've come full circle from where you started and everything is nicely wrapped up and no loose ends, right? You have a chance to reflect on the first thing you began the essay with in your intro. So that's always a really effective way to go about your conclusion, is think about what you do in the intro and then come back to that. Call that forth back into your essay again for that sense of closure and satisfaction for your readers. I'll show you one more example. So here's another NPR article that began with a very poetic type of intro because it emerges us immediately in a scene. The voice was soft and scratchy, as if a bit timid in front of the microphone. So lots of sensory details, rich, vivid words that call forth in our minds, a particular scene. She said, meaning yes in Hawaiian when asked a question by a male voice. Yes, I was born here, she said. That voice of an elderly Hawaiian woman was that of my great-grandmother, speaking her native language. It sent chills down my spine. So this is a very specific intro. And here's the last paragraphs of that article and how it concludes. As for my family, my great-grandmother did not pass along the Hawaiian language to her children. My grandmother and my father never learned to speak it, but that doesn't mean it's too late. So we call back the great-grandma, right? We began here with the idea of her sort of speaking, and then she comes back here as well. Last year, we joined this cultural group. We learn how to express the Hawaiian songs and stories of old Hawaii. Word by word, we are trying to teach ourselves what got dropped between the generations and hold on. So looking towards the future, reflecting on the significance of the issue discussed in the paper, a really powerful conclusion. And you'll notice too, both the intro and the conclusion have these really vivid words, great word choice. The sentences have a rhythm, so it definitely leaves a powerful impression with the reader. Moments where we call back where we started in the intro. So in the conclusion, I just want to give you one final reminder to use powerful language to leave an impression in that conclusion. The intro and the conclusion should have the strongest language of your paper. So you draw people in and then you leave them thoughtful after your essay, or you leave them with a sense of what they need to do. Provoke some sort of action. So in the intro, that powerful language makes them interested, makes them keep reading, and in the conclusion, it leaves them with a lasting impact. You want them to feel, you want them to think, and almost always you also want them to act, to do something, because that is what makes writing powerful, right? The ability to change people's attitudes and behaviors, share your story, make a powerful argument, and change the world. So it's time to start thinking as you're drafting your paper. You may not be ready yet, but you can definitely come back to this as you're getting to the conclusion to think through what your conclusion should do and then what it can do. What are the possibilities for how you can move the audience with your conclusion? Thank you very much for watching.